Ja, herzlich willkommen zu diesem Webinar des Außenwirtschaftscenters London zum Thema Recycling and Resource Management in the UK. Mein Name ist Michael Müller, ich bin der Wirtschaftsdelegierte in London. Ich sage herzlich willkommen und danke, dass Sie heute live dabei sind, um zu erfahren, wo denn da in diesem sehr wichtigen und zukunftsweisenden Sektor auch im Vereinigten Königreich Geschäftschancen liegen, welche Trends es gibt, welche Potenziale, wie man daran arbeiten kann, mit wem man zum Erfolg kommen kann. Vielleicht ganz kurz davor, bevor wir so richtig hineinstarten, ganz kurz, was tut sich denn jetzt in London? Naja, Sie wissen vielleicht, am 4. Juli sind hier Parlamentswahlen. Das heißt, das ist das alles beherrschende Thema und die Meinungsumfragen gehen davon aus, dass die oppositionelle Labour-Partei das Rennen machen wird. Das heißt, dass es zu einem Regierungswechsel kommen wird. Dann vielleicht zweites Thema, so ein bisschen Good News. Ja, das Vereinigte Königreich hat doch ein BIP-Wachstum von plus 0,6% im ersten Quartal 2024 hingelegt. Das klingt jetzt nicht so viel, wenn man sich aber in Europa umschaut, ist das durchaus eine der höheren Kennziffern. Also es gibt eine Art so, es geht moderat wieder bergauf. Und vielleicht die dritte Nachricht, die ich mit Ihnen teilen möchte, ist, dass sich die österreichischen Exporte in das Vereinigte Königreich sehr, sehr gut entwickelt haben. Also letztes Jahr ein Wachstum bei den Waren von doch knapp 7%, deutlich mehr als unser weltweiter Durchschnitt. Und Großbritannien ist für uns ein ganz, ganz wichtiger Markt, auch dank Ihnen, Ihrer Unternehmen, die hoffentlich schon die ersten Schritte oder ersten Projekte hier gemacht haben. Ja, wir sprechen hier über doch ansprechende Volumina von ungefähr 5,5 Milliarden an Warenexport, über 3 Milliarden an Dienstleistungen und mehr als 8 Milliarden Euro, die österreichische Unternehmen hier im Vereinigten Königreich investiert haben. Ich habe jetzt auf Deutsch gesprochen. Ich bin der Einzige, der das heute zu Ihnen macht. Wir switchen jetzt gleich auf Englisch und ich leite über zu unserem Senior Sector Manager Peter Franklin, der bei uns schon viele Jahre sehr erfolgreich und sehr gut mit viel Erfahrung und Netzwerken österreichische Firmen berät bei allen solchen Themen von Infrastruktur über Bau, Umwelttechnik und durchaus auch die Industrie. Peter, please give it a go and let's introduce our speakers and the program.
Thank you very much, Michael, and good afternoon, everybody. I'm delighted from my side that you've all joined us today. I'm also delighted that we've got two excellent speakers who I think between them have got 50 years experience in the waste and recycling sector. So what they don't know, probably you don't need to know. In a minute, Claudia Amos from Ceres Waste, Renewables and Environment will give us an overview of the regulatory framework and the market structure. And then Lee Marshall from the Chartered Institute of Waste Management will explain how the challenge of meeting recycling targets is leading to innovation and where opportunities lie. But before we get on to those presentations, just a couple of points or a couple of housekeeping points. Next slide. Yeah. So perhaps the most important thing, if you've got questions, I'm just letting somebody else in. If you've got questions, please do use the chat box and put your questions in the chat box. We have a question and answer session at the end of the webinar, and we will hope to answer as many of your questions as possible. So those that we cannot answer during the hour, we will come back to you and try to answer after the webinar. And the other thing I would say is that we are recording this, so be aware of that. After the webinar, you will receive a copy of all the slides and a link to the recording, which will be put up on YouTube. And now, without further ado, I would like to introduce our first speaker. Claudia Amos is Director at Ceres Waste, Renewables and Environment. She has 25 years of senior project manager and consulting experience in the UK, Europe, the US, and Asia. She's worked with public bodies, investors, technology developers, brands, waste producers, and many others. Claudia, over to you.
Thank you very much. And after OAP, I actually speak German. I'm dual national German, German and British. But by now, I find it much easier to do it in English. So then I will give my presentation in English today. And what you can see from the overview and the title, I will take you on a whistle-stop tour through the UK waste industry and provide you with an overview of the level of implementation of circular material flows in the UK. So if you could have the next slide, please. And the next one. So I start with a short introduction. And firstly, I would like to give you a short introduction to Ceres. So we are a fairly new consultancy. While we have been in the sector for, as Peter said, a long time. We have relaunched the Ceres as a consultancy practice in 2024 with myself, Simon Applin, and Jeremy Warmington, who joined Stephen Weiss, who originally founded the company, as Ceres directors and expanded the company to provide passionate and professional advisory service in these 5 key areas. So we help with due diligence for investments, company buyouts, mergers and acquisitions. We do a lot of feedstock studies and off-take market evaluations. We help with policy, regulation, and compliance. We facilitate circular material flows, so working with packaging producers, manufacturers, brands, and we also produce expert witness reports if things goes wrong to help for contractual and criminal court proceedings. But enough of us. Let's start on the UK market. And if we could move to the next slide, please. So this gives you an overview of the UK, and the UK has made considerable progress since the early 2000s in implementing recycling infrastructure to meet European targets according to the waste hierarchy. Today, the key drivers are carbon reduction and resource efficiency targets to meet net zero and circular economy initiative. This is true across the UK, where environmental issues are devolved matters. So what it means is that England, Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland all have their own parliamentary discussions and parliamentary strategies on policies, on taxation and implementation, and also they have their individual implementation bodies. So when you are working in the UK, as you might be familiar, in the environmental matter and the recycling and waste sector, you will have to take notice that it's a devolved matter and you need to have a quick look where you are in the country. However, 80 to 85% of waste are created in England, so that's a very big part of the market. And in the last 10 years, recycling rates in England have been mainly stagnating, as the shift has been mainly from moving residual waste, so that's big waste in your black bags or in your black or grey bins, from landfill disposal to energy from waste to energy recovery and the build out of the energy recovery infrastructure. The good news is there is considerable opportunity in the collection, separation and sorting of recyclates to improve circularity and to reuse materials in manufacturing to lower carbon emissions in the UK. So there's still a big way to go and a long way to go. If you could have the next slide, please. I've given you a bit of an overview so you can see how the 68 million tons of solid non-hazardous waste flows in England today. And while this is very similar to Austria and other countries, I just like to make you aware of 3 key differences. So at the moment, the UK doesn't have a dual collection system as it's uses in continental Europe, where you have the dual green dot system with a separate packaging system, packaging collection system. In the UK, packaging is either collected from households via local authority contracts, or if it's a commercial premise, via private waste management contracts. And then the collected waste is channeled to sorting, separation facilities, and then to the recycling sector, depending on the waste type. The latter is issuing packaging, recycling, and recovery notices, so-called PRNs, to verify the recycled packaging, and these are then traded on the market. Therefore, the PRN pricing and system, which often looks very good, especially in the latter years, mainly reflect supply and demand and don't necessarily reflect the costs or the value of the recycled market. But this is all under review with a new EPR system and the introduction of the extended producer responsibility and the deposit return systems. The second point is regarding contracting and who is responsible for waste. England has a two-tier local authority system, which means there are district and county authorities in many areas, and these are responsible for different things. The districts are mainly the collection authorities who often do collection contracts, and the county authorities are often the disposal or treatment authorities, which are responsible to let treatment contracts. So depending on what you're selling where, you also need to be aware who your customer is. However, to make it really complex, you also have borough and metropolitan authorities, which are combined, and you've got combined authorities in Wales and Scotland, for example. But that's just a bit of an anomaly, which I think is important to point out. And it's really relevant when you're working in the market and would like to get your foot into or who your counterparty is. And finally, the collection and sorting and separation market is fairly dominated by the large waste firms. However, the composting and recycling and biogas or ID market is more fragmented and independently owned. So you also have a bit of a two sides to the system, who's owning what and who's responsible for which parts. But we will go into this a bit later. Let's have a look who's actually driving the market, please. Go to the next slide. So what are the drivers for investment and more importantly for circular material flows? There is a reduction of carbon emissions and avoidance or mitigation of environmental impacts. Waste is a key to energy transition and circular material flows. So there's this big overarching target everywhere in the world, I would say, that is driving what we are doing in the waste and circular material flows. Regulatory and policy frameworks have always been shaping the waste industry. It started off with public health, then environmental target, and now it's really resource efficiency, carbon reduction. And environment, as I said before, and renewables are devolved matters, so you will have individual regulations in those devolved nations. And finally, financial incentive schemes. Often regulatory policy in the UK is linked to financials, so it's more financial incentives than targets, and that includes market push initiatives for waste-derived products, so plastic tax, for example, as well as market pull areas, subsidy payments for green gas, renewable transport fuel, and others. And also on the financial side, and key driver is viability and profitability because of the privately funded nature of the industry in the UK. So this is just giving you an overview. Let's have a look at the individual regs and some of the key areas that are relevant at the moment. And I think Lee will go into this in a bit more detail later. So I'm just giving you a broad overview. You can see the key policies at different stages of the circular economy implementation in the UK. Wales is clearly leading the pack. It started quite early with a lot of focus and also quite a bit of public funding into circular economy, recycling initiatives. It had higher targets in the other devolved nations. So that's why it's leading at the moment. And overall, across the UK, you have the plastic packaging tax, which I think is quite famous and well known. So if you are selling packaging with less than 30% recycled plastics, that might be taxable. And that's really to create a market pull for people to use recycled materials. It's a bit similar to the circular economy package that's implemented in the continental Europe and the new packaging waste directive to really drive recycled targets and not just recycling targets. Implementation of an EPR scheme, implementation of deposit return scheme for bottles and beverage containers, and then, which is really, again, the implementation will very much depend on the next government. So if we have a new government which might want to review some of these areas, or the existing government, which will hopefully then roll it out. But this is a bit, it will depend how it's actually going to be implemented. But this provides you with a bit of an overview. The other measures are the support for sustainable aviation and transport fuels, which is quite specific for the UK. So in the UK is the RTFO, so that's the renewable transport fuel obligation, and there are benefit payments to produce renewable fuels for use in different either transport or drop-in fuel. So that's quite a big sector and quite an interesting area in the UK. So let's have a look at the key circular economy opportunities. If we could move to the next slide, please. So at the moment, UK circular economy investment rose over 1.3 billion in 2023, and we are expecting this growth to continue. And where is the growth likely to happen? I think there will be considerable growth in the simpler green recycling mandate to provide uniform and simplified collection systems in the UK. This will be a key driver for infrastructure investments along the supply chain, as it's a real mess, if I have to be honest, in the UK, that literally my neighbour, the road down, because they're in a different county to me, have a different container and different collection system than I have, that makes it really difficult to have efficient infrastructure, and also it will hopefully increase the amount of material and the quality of material which is being collected. This will then also go through then to the sorting and separation infrastructure and plants to sort, clean and prepare materials for recycling, and then the reuse of secondary materials in manufacturing. The UK at the moment heavily relies on recycling exports for most materials. Therefore, there's a real need in the UK to onshore some of these manufacturing opportunities, as well as into investment and knowledge sharing to build up that industry. And finally, as I said, the UK is leading in the support for sustainable transport and aviation fuels. Therefore, this is really a key growth sector. And there are 3 large-scale waste to sustainable aviation fuel plants in the UK at the moment, which are also supported by the government. And a lot of this will also not just need equipment and products, but also knowledge and data tracking and data management services, because all of this needs to be tracked, monitored, measured, evaluated to make it most efficient, and also to tell us what the actual impact is in terms of carbon reduction. So let's have a look at who's likely to invest and who might be a customer for all of these opportunities. You could have the next slide, please. So firstly, there are the tier 1 waste firms, and I'm not really sure if tier 1 is a very well-known term. It's basically the largest or the national waste firms in the UK. And these are Veolia, Biffa, Suez, and Viridor at the moment, who all have slightly different shapes and area of focus, but they're all key providers of circular material flows in the UK, and especially for local authority waste. The second tier companies, so the slightly smaller companies, are often focused on certain waste types or certain geographies in the UK, or certain parts of the supply chain. So they might produce mainly collection and separation, but don't own treatment infrastructure, or they might focus on certain treatment infrastructure like hazardous waste recycling, for example, and not have the other services. But all of the above are investing in circular material flows in form of resources, knowledge and infrastructure, And in particular, the infrastructure part can often not be funded on balance sheets alone. And also a lot of the more circular options are involving novel technologies and therefore cannot be financed purely by debt funding or through banks and other means. And this very much explains the key influence of the private equity funders in the UK, as shown on the next slide. So I've given you a bit of a snapshot on who owns infrastructure and who owns different recycling plants and collection infrastructure and waste companies in the UK, and also a bit of a history, which I'm not all going through. But one of the things is that the UK waste infrastructure is mainly privately owned and not so much publicly owned. And a lot of these private equity funds and venture capital firms are also then selling and buying different portfolios. So there's quite a lot of activity going on there in terms of who owns what and the different connotations. So if somebody buys something else, they often repackage it. For example, when Wirtschaftskammer got investment, they then divested into the energy and waste infrastructure. And today they are mainly working on the recycling side. So that just gives you a quick insight, a bit of who and who's who, and maybe slightly different names than you normally hear. So if you go to the next slide. While the regulatory forces and the financial incentive systems are shaping the industry, the profitability of key waste operation and the circular economy supply chains are very much driving the private investment, and they are setting the pace for the implementation of circular material flows. So you can see mainly commercial organizations and their motivation to be viable in the circular economy will be key to provide opportunities for investment, sales, and knowledge sharing with Austrian companies and others. And while the government will intervene in the market to achieve net zero and push environmental solutions, the collaboration and the sharing of values across the recycling and circular material flows along the supply chain will be a key factor in where investments are being made. And I've provided you a quick overview of the different regulators, public and privately funded facilitators, and some of the key bodies, and the CIWM Lee represents is one of them, who are quite influential in the UK. So overall, we are trying to address some key issues really across the value chain. And while there is a huge opportunity in the UK, there are certainly also some key challenges. So if we can move to the next slide, please. Final slide. So these are really a quick insight on the left-hand side in terms of the challenges and opportunities. The UK is quite a fragmented market. Currently, there are some issues regarding planning and permitting of infrastructure, and kind of like finding bankable technologies, especially in some of the advanced sectors like plastics recycling, there are challenges within the sector. But opportunities are the UK is a fairly mature market, so it's very well organized. While we've got lots of players, I think there are certain rules and regulations around it. There's a key domestic market need. There are some very good regulatory drivers, and there's certainly an investment demand overall. So that is the left-hand side. And on the right-hand side, I think these are more general issues that really are important to create circular material flows all over the world. So one is really to move from the tonnage targets to carbon accounting and really make the most of net zero and the carbon impact, commercialization of new technologies, AI, sorting, hard recycled materials, and particularly in the UK, the renewable fuel production, funding and financing the waste industry and making it worthwhile, because you need a viable recycling industry to grow your recycling industry and take these opportunities, to incentivize the manufacture and consumption of recycled materials and products. The UK is leading on the plastic tax at the moment, which is quite considerable and creates those market environments we are looking for. Pre-competitive collaboration. You cannot do circular economy on your own, so you always need to be aware who's kind of like below and above, and how does a whole supply chain benefit from it, as well as raising awareness and share knowledge across the value chain. And I think that's really why we are working across different countries, and I think why webinars like this are really, really important, because the knowledge sharing with experience, equipment and products is just fantastic, because otherwise we're also not creating a circular economy. And I think that is me, and I thank you very much for listening, and I'm looking forward to answering your question later.
Thank you very much, Claudia. Very interesting, quite a lot of information there to take in. We're going to move on to Lee in a minute, but I just had a question did come in from somebody who's interested specifically more on the minerals and mineral recovery streams. I think really from the construction side, for example. Is that an area which is very much has its own supply chains and own regulatory regimes, or how would you see that fitting into this?
Absolutely, and this is also a key sector. The construction sector has actually been leading on the net zero and carbon regulations, and aggregate recycling is probably one of the really working streams. I think one of the key things is space, as always, how to collect material, get it from the building sites, and then how to reuse it and how to account for that in the new buildings. But that is really, it's a big sector in there. The thing is, waste is, well, as a consultant's always good, waste is complex. Each of the different streams, waste streams and types of waste have their own little environment and ecosystem. So super happy to answer questions maybe after the webinar or later on that. But clearly there's a huge opportunity for that as well, especially because UK is fairly small as an island, and we need building supplies and construction materials.
Yeah, and I do know that there are organisations which are looking very carefully into circularity and waste in the UK. The questioner, perhaps we can talk about that afterwards as well. And if there's specific questions, or if you want help to be networked with the right people, perhaps we can chat to see how we can support you, or how Claudia might be able to support you after the webinar as well. Okay, I'd like to move on to, thank you very much for that, Claudia. I'd like to move on now to our second speaker, Lee Marshall. Lee is Director for Innovation and Technical Services at the Chartered Institute of Wastes Management. So that's wastes with an S at the end, which I noticed. So which means that's just going to highlight the different waste streams that there are. So, and perhaps the different sectors that they feed into. The Chartered Institute of Waste Management represents 5,500 individuals and 250 affiliated companies in the sector. Lee was previously the CEO for the Local Authority Regulatory Advisory Committee and has sat on advisory boards for packaging and electrical waste. He's also worked in the private sector with a large waste company and a multinational waste consultancy. So, Lee, I'd like to hand over to you now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter. I will admit to not being very good with languages, so I'll throw that out there now, which I live in Wales and have done for the last 18 years as well. So that's not very good of me, but I'll attempt to start and finish the presentation, hopefully with a little bit of language. So, guten Abend, good afternoon, and to round it off in Welsh, prynawn da, and hope my presentation is a lot more understandable. So if we go on to the next slide, please. I'm just wondering, oh, there we go, and the next one. So just to give you a bit of an overview of what I'll cover, so I'll just explain a little bit about CIWM and what we do, and thank you to Peter for including the S on the end of wastes. That often gets missed off. A little bit about how the sector's adapting, and that'll build and overlap a little bit with some of the stuff you've heard from Claudia. Then also how the waste policies are impacting on retailers, because we deal with a lot of obviously products that come from retailers, and then some of the opportunities and challenges that these may present, and then a little bit at the end about networking. So next slide, please. So a little bit about us. So our purpose is to move the world beyond waste, which I appreciate may sound a bit strange given that we have waste in the title, but we're about resource management nowadays, and our figures there are slightly updated. So we've got about 6,400 members now across the whole of the UK and Ireland as well, Southern Ireland, and about 250 organisations across the UK. And we're the professional body for waste management within the UK. We're a membership organisation, but we also provide training and qualifications as well, and things around technical advice and information on a wide range of subjects, so not just household waste. Next slide, please. Now, me and my particular team, we've got a focus on the policy work the institution does. So we sit on over sort of about 60 working groups, and these range from ones organised specifically by government, but also industry-wide ones as well, and things around sort of British standards or European standards as well. We organise responses to consultations that government run. 2022, there was 33 we responded out of a possible 60. I think last year that figure had gone up and it was almost one a week. And we also support a presidential report. So each year we have a new president and they release a piece of research and we help support that for them. And also we are the UK member organisation for ISWA, which is the International Solid Waste Association. So it gives you a flavour of what we do as an organisation, and more specifically me and my team. So next slide, please. And I want to put this up to start to show you how the sector is changing. So this is how we organise our policy work within CIWM, and it's a change. So we've got our mission there, a world beyond waste, at the top. And we believe the circular economy feeds into that. And that's actually where the resources and waste sector in the UK operate. We operate in the circular economy. And we would actually argue that we operate at the heart of it. And so we had a look at, well, what policy areas influence that? And that's the areas in the blue boxes there. So things about resource efficient design, behaviour change, and producer responsibility. And these are areas that traditionally the waste sector may not have got involved in or looked at, and we as CIWM wouldn't have. But it's the way that the context in which we operate and the environment in which we operate is moving. So as a sector, we need to look at how things are designed in order to be able to get the best out of them at their end of life. And we need to look at things like behaviour change. So if we can't get people using the right systems in the right way, or even consuming things in the right way, it makes the operation of a circular economy a lot more difficult. So this is just to give you a flavour of how we believe the sector is actually starting to evolve and morph, and we're not just a waste sector anymore. We're at the heart of the circular economy. We're about managing resources. Next slide, please. And the reason that we believe we're at the heart of the circular economy and why we believe that's important is because of the circular economy's role in mitigating climate change. So if you've read some of the work by the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, they estimate that goods and services account for approximately 45% of emissions, global greenhouse gas emissions. Now, traditionally, when you look at the emissions of the waste sector in the UK, they account for only about 5 to 7%, and there are direct emissions from landfill activities, energy from waste, things like that. So at face value, the sector isn't important to climate change. But then when you look at the impact of the circular economy and our role in that, then actually as a sector, we become very important to mitigating climate change. And that will become more apparent as the sector evolves further into things like repair, reuse, resale, etc. And currently, in terms of the English government, the UK government, there isn't a circular economy plan as such. So whenever you hear UK politicians in government, at least, talking about the circular economy, you'll probably hear them reference the resources and waste strategy, which isn't really a circular economy government document. So there's a lot of work potentially policy-wise to get us to this place in the UK. Next slide, please. So we think that actually the sector that we operate in at the moment is being redefined, and we came up with this definition for work we're doing with the Department for Education on green skills. So as I've said, our sector, we believe, is at the very core of the circular economy. And we start the moment something is discarded, and it's finished the moment something is disposed of. And disposed of in this context could mean given a second life, put back into use. So we want to try and keep resources in economic use for as long as possible. And then that final at the bottom just gives you an idea of the breadth of things we're involved in. So we clean, we sort, we collect, we treat, we digest. There's a whole range of activities we undertake, and that means there's a whole range of supplies that the sector and the industry needs from the likes of your companies and others in order to make sure that we keep doing what we're doing and we evolve into the circular economy. Next slide, please. So what does that mean in terms of where we're evolving to? Well, again, Claudia touched on this a little bit, but in terms of the innovation that's coming into the sector, we're seeing a lot more around AI and robotics, and this is particularly prevalent in sorting. So traditionally in the UK, you'll have material recycling facilities, MRFs, and there'll be a lot of conveyor belts, a lot of manual picking, people literally there picking the various materials out, a little bit of mechanical sorting, maybe with sort of eddy current sorters and what have you, magnets. And there'll still be a place for those sorts of technologies, but we're starting to see a lot more robotics and AI thinking going into this. So there's a new MRF that's been built recently in Coventry, one of the newest in the UK, and that has minimized manual sorting in it. So you're seeing a lot of AI, you're seeing a lot of robotics in there, picking out various materials. And it's the way that the UK market is likely to go for its MRFs. Alongside that, we're starting to see the emergence of chemical recycling. So this is specifically for plastics. So traditionally, mechanical recycling, you would probably collect the plastics, you would grade it, and then you might chop it into flakes. And at that point, it would be given back to the reprocessors. With the chemical recycling, they're looking at almost breaking it back down into its constituent chemicals, almost a sort of, I don't know, a reverse process of sort of petrochemical manufacturing. And then you've got carbon capture as well. So within the UK, you've got the emissions trading scheme, and the energy from waste plants are being brought into that scheme from 2028. So they're then looking at how perhaps we can bolt on or build into EFW's carbon capture. So that's a new and emerging technology that the UK is specifically looking at. And then when you look at the evolution of the sector and moving into circular economy, you're looking at things like repair, reuse, and there's a big skills gap there. So currently there's a hub in Greater Manchester that's been developed by Suez, and they're looking to really maximize the amount of reuse and repair that they get out of all the waste that's delivered to the household waste recycling centres within Greater Manchester, and also on the collections from households. So it's a really big area of growth for our sector, and I'll demonstrate that in a minute. Next slide, please. So how do we think that the sector is evolved in the next 30 years or so? Well, if you look back 30 years, roughly when I came into the industry, when I did my degree, we were still talking about dilute and disperse landfills. So this is where landfills would perhaps leakage from it, in effect, in a controlled manner that in theory was supposed to dilute the contaminants that were in there and disperse them into the environment. Now, obviously, we've come a long way from them. And now in the UK, we've got modern energy from waste plants that treat residual waste. A lot of them have got heat capture with that as well. They generate the electricity. But we're at a point now where we're not sure in the UK how much of that we need. Have we got about the right levels if we want to increase the recycling to where it's at? And Claudia mentioned about devolved nature of waste. And in Scotland, they did a energy from waste review last year. And again, one of the recommendations from that was that there should be no more energy from waste facilities built. As I've already mentioned, we're starting to see carbon capture come in. In terms of anaerobic digestion, we're going to see a big expansion to that because of the mandatory food waste collection requirements that will be on English local authorities from 2026. So are we going to see a change in the scale of plants? Are the plants themselves going to get bigger, or may they actually go smaller but may be placed more locally? So if we've seen this level of change in the last 30 years, it's reasonable to expect in the next 30 years there will be a similar level of change in terms of technology. Now, at the moment, we're not sure what it is, but it's unlikely we'll have an infrastructure based on EFW in 2050. It could be some sort of different technology, maybe some sort of pyrolysis, some sort of mechanical biological treatment. It's not exactly clear what it'll be, but it's reasonable to expect that in 2050 we'll have a different infrastructure treating a different set of waste compared to the EFW infrastructure we've got now. And there is this question going forward about, will there always be waste? I think by 2050 we may not have eradicated it completely, but what we consider as waste that needs some sort of final treatment is likely to be a much smaller fraction of the weight of the overall waste stream than there is at the moment. Next slide. So we've applied the same principle to collections. Again, 25 years ago, when I sort of started my first role in a local authority in southeast England, we were still putting out bring banks. Curbside collections weren't really happening then at all. And yet today we've got 100% curbside coverage, and for the majority of materials as well across the UK, very definitely here in Wales, but in England, Scotland, Northern Ireland as well. And we're collecting things like films and flexibles nowadays. Food waste in Wales and Scotland is across all local authorities and will be, as I've mentioned, in England by 2026. And we're looking at collecting things like textiles and batteries and WEEE from the curbside. So a wide range of materials that previously, 25 years ago, we only had bring banks maybe for glass and maybe paper. So again, if you fast forward to 2040, it's likely that the way we collect and what we collect will be very different. So will we have smart bins? Perhaps you don't have a specific collection day anymore, but you put your bin out when it, I don't know, 80% full, and it's connected to the internet, and that sends a message to the council that says, oh, you need to collect this bin tomorrow because it's been put out. So all our vehicles maybe are linked up to some sort of smart route mapping software that gives them a new round every day, rather than at the moment where, you know, the same vehicle does the same round every Monday. And what will the vehicles look like and be powered by? Will they be electric vehicles or will they be hydrogen? So there is Westminster Council in London that's trialling electric vehicles, and one or two other councils. And then there's St Helens in the northwest of England that's trialling hydrogen powered vehicles. So they're going to change. We don't exactly know how yet. We're not sure which technology is likely to power refuse collection vehicles, recycling vehicles, but that is going to change. And what will that then mean for our transfer stations? Because if it's electric, they're going to need to be all powered up to the grid, docking stations, etc. And what will the depots look like? Well, they need to be transfer stations where we can drop off all these different materials that we're collecting and keep them separated. And what will that mean in terms of the sort of conveyor belts, the balers, the forklifts or the graders that we need? So there's all these different considerations. Again, we know it will be different in 2040, but at the moment we can't exactly say how. Next slide, please. So just going back to the skills, CIWM did some research and surveyed companies that were operating in our sector and asked them what they thought would be prevalent in the future, which green occupations would be most important. And you can see a list there. So in the near term, it's sort of the roles that perhaps you would associate perhaps more with the sector. So recycling managers, regulatory and compliance roles, and material sorting. But then when you look at the medium term, people are saying, well, we're going to need circular economy specialists, and we're going to need change managers, and we're going to need reuse and repair on industrial scales. And then you look at the long-term skills, and they're talking about automation and AI and net zero. Now, at the moment, they're not the sort of skills and careers that people who are perhaps doing computer degrees or engineering degrees, they probably wouldn't think about the waste sector as a profession. But going forward in the long term, we're going to need to attract those sort of people if we're going to evolve the way we think we're going to need to evolve. Next slide, please. And this gives you an idea of the sort of scale of the roles. And I think the big one that stands out for me there is reuse and repair. Now, these are estimates, admittedly, but, we think that potentially there could be 140,000 new roles in reuse and repair in the future, in the longer term. And to put that into context, we estimate that that's roughly about the number that are operating in the sector in totality at the moment. So if we're seeing an increase in just that area alone of doubling of size, and then you add in all the other areas, it's a massive change in what our sector will look like. And again, that then carries over into the sorts of supplies and the services and the goods and the way we organise ourselves that are going to be needed. Next slide, please. So we've already touched on these a little bit, but in terms of then looking specifically more on packaging, these are the sort of policy drivers that are driving the UK at the moment. So extended producer responsibility on packaging. And within that, there's the modulated fees. So this is where the more recyclable your material is or your product is, the less fees you have to pay into the system. Conversely, the less recyclable it is, the more fees you have to pay. So it makes sense that retailers and manufacturers are looking to try and change the way their packaging is made and the materials it's made from to make it as recyclable as possible. And again, Claudia has already mentioned the plastics packaging tax, and this, we believe, has been a big driver behind brands and retailers and packaging producers looking at what their materials are made of and trying to get as much recycled material back into their resource streams. And then especially in the UK, you've got this public perception of plastic. It's almost a demonized material, and the public generally had a very bad view of it. So this, again, in turn, from a corporate point of view and a marketing point of view, means that retailers and brands are trying to move away from it as much as possible. Next slide, please. And this is why you're seeing things like this. We're seeing a bit of I couldn't think of a witty term, but a dash for paper and fibre. So these are recent developments in packaging. We're seeing a move out of plastic, and we're seeing a move back into fibre-based packaging. Now, on the surface, this looks very low and environmentally friendly, but I'm sure as some of you will realise with the products you supply into the market, you can't just make something out of paper and fibre alone and expect it to be waterproof and food grade, etc. There needs to be coatings applied to it. And there's an issue at the moment with the way the sector is set up, is can we cope with these sorts of materials coming through? Can we separate them from traditional fibre? Can we get the coatings off them so that we can recycle the fibre? And if we can't, what sort of machinery or robotics or technology is going to enable us to do that? And actually taking a step back, how can they be applied in such a way? How can these, whatever they are, plastic barriers maybe, or coatings, how can they be applied in such a way that actually enable us to get them off in the first place? There's an issue there for the packaging people. If you supply into the packaging chain, how can you think about, well, if they're going to make things out of fibre based, how can we get coatings on there in such a way that we can get them back off again when they come to the end of their life? Next slide, please. And again, we're starting to see retailers, getting on board these sorts of things. So Morrison's, one of the main supermarkets in the UK, they've got dedicated pod back coffee collection in their stores. We're seeing a lot more things happening at front of stores. So in the UK, you're seeing a lot of flexible and film collection banks at the front of stores. And they're only going to look at this more and more as they go forward. So the boundary between our sector, as it were, the resources and waste sector, and the producers and the brands is blurring as they become much more interested in their materials and getting it back. Next slide, please. So what are the opportunities? Well, I've sort of touched these, I've gone through, but definitely for sorting technology and the way that the collection policy called simpler recycling is moving forward. Previously, under consistent collections as a local authority, you'd probably have to separate your waste more into curbside sort systems. But by rebranding it simpler recycling, the government have made it easier for local authorities to collect what we call commingled, so in one bin. So that means the sorting technology is going to have to improve rapidly. On the back of that then is the reprocessing technology. So we're starting to see reprocessors in the UK bolting stuff on the front of their plants to tidy up household waste, as it were, to get it in a better condition to go through their processes. And then there's the end markets. So where are the end markets? Again, at the moment, quite a lot of them abroad, we export a lot of material, but there's a desire for the UK to become more resource resilient and have their own end markets. And that's going to require the skills. As I've already said, chemical recycling, that's emerging. And all of this needs data. So there was a question earlier on about construction and demolition waste. And the thing is, we believe that that's doing very well. We believe that it's recycling a lot of material, but ultimately we don't have the data behind it to prove that. So data is going to be a big growth area within the waste and resources sector in the UK. How we collect it, how we present it, how we interrogate it. Next slide, please. And then just finally on networking. So how can you get into the UK waste scene, as it were? Well, you can utilise organisations like CIWM. There's an organisation called the Environmental Services Association that represents the likes of BIFRA and SUEZ, etc. So we're fairly well networked up. Well, actually, we're very well networked up, I should say. So you can come through us. But then events. So there's a big event in September in Birmingham called RWM. There's various conferences throughout the year. You could look at perhaps hosting roundtables or exchange studies and study tours, I should say. So there's various ways perhaps you can look at utilising the networks and the organisation we've already in the UK to then find out a bit more and to start to get into some of the organisations that you may want to talk to. And I believe that may be me done. Next slide. It was. So hopefully that gave you a flavour of where we're at and the opportunities. And I will try and round off with colloquial languages by saying danke schön, thank you, and to round off in Wales, diolch yn fawr.
Thank you very much, Lee. And I don't know what to say to the Welsh, but I know our ambassador's going to Wales in a week or so's time, so maybe we'll have to get you to teach him some Welsh too. Lee, that was very interesting. Thanks very much. Fascinating to see actually how the mystery behind where the sector might go in the next 30 years. Mm. And on that note, where does that mean investors are looking? Does that put investors off because they don't know what to invest in, or is it a case of plants and technology being more flexible, or what implications do you see in that?
Yeah, I think that the political situation in the UK hasn't helped in terms of confidence for investors. So we had a resource and waste strategy produced in 2018, but the implementation of it has been very slow, and there's been several delays in the key policies in EPR, DRS, and simpler recycling. So I think that's probably created a bit of nervousness for investors. So I think one of the things that will help that is actually starting to see these policies being delivered by whichever government comes in. I think that will help. I think the ETS is probably an opportunity for investment because there's a bit more surety around that. So that would then start to, especially in terms of the energy from waste infrastructure and the possibilities that ETS may offer that in terms of carbon capture and stuff. So I think that will help. But I think, yeah, you're right, that there may be an element of flexibility needed in some respects. But equally, I think sorting infrastructure and AD infrastructure and collections, I think there's enough surety there that, again, there's probably opportunities for investment in those sorts of areas.
Okay. By the way, I should say, if anyone's got questions that they want to post, please do so. We've got another 7 or 8 minutes, and it would be great if you've got any questions that you'd like to ask. But in the meantime, you touched on the government. I just wondered whether Claudia or Lee, you mentioned, I think Claudia, you mentioned at the very beginning that I think you implied the direction of travel will largely continue, and regardless of the outcome of the election that's coming up next month in the UK. Do you see Do you see that being the case, and how committed do you think the UK government is to their targets, their recycling targets?
That is a really good question. If I just may kind of like maybe weave in also your previous question on the investors, I think there's also the different types of investors. So you have the kind of like the venture capitalist investors who are often investing in new technology, super active in the UK. UK got lots of startups in new technologies, AI, as Lee said, sorting technologies, chemical recycling, and so on. And then there's kind of like the impact investors, who is basically a specific investment tranche that really looks at these, and often not just looks at the financial returns, but also at the carbon impact. So that's kind of like going all in the direction. And then you got the infrastructure investors Lee mentioned, who have mainly been investing in energy from waste, but also now getting into sorting, general waste management companies. So investing in the whole supply chain to a certain degree, and the whole system. So I think answering your question, I think that will be continue, because the UK is not isolated. I think it's a worldwide trend, it's a national trend to decarbonisation. But the question is really how that's going to be implemented, and is it viable? These are the two big questions. And for whom is it viable? And how much support is needed from government or other sources? So, for example, plastic tax gives you a certain amount of money. How is that distributed? Is that just being taken by the recycling sector, or is that also distributed to the collectors, and so on? And I think these questions are really important. Lee said ETS, energy from waste. I think carbon capture and carbon utilization will be at a couple of big projects where it really fits, but there's a huge trend, for example, to take plastics out of your residual waste stream before it goes into the energy from waste plant. So that's quite established equipment. That's a conveyor belts. That's something we all can do that already to decarbonize the waste that goes into the waste recovery plant, and really helps reduce the carbon impact. And how these individual policy and plans for EPR and kind of like unified recycling are going to be implemented, that will very much steer the investment, because they're looking at, where is it viable to invest, where do we have long-term security, or at least 5 to 10 years, and how we can take part. But I think the general direction will continue, and it might be a bit different to continental Europe. But I think the general tranche is done. The motivation is the same, and the need is the same. So I think that's where it's very much aligned, and will go into that direction. And it might be a bit quicker, hopefully, with some policy incentives and support, or it might take a bit more time, which we really don't have, if it's purely relying on those financial mechanisms.
Yeah, I mean, I'd agree with that, and I think on a basic level, EPR and simpler recycling aren't contentious policies.
No.
Elements of them are, but on a basic level, they're not contentious, and there's a lot of work already been done on them. So although they're not implemented, they're a long way along. So they're easy to push through. And actually, compared to 4 or 5 years ago, the number of civil servants working on these policies now is greatly increased. So that gives you confidence that they're going to push through with them. DRS is a bit more controversial, but I think on a basic level, those policies will get continued with. They're, like I say, they're fairly easy wins, as it were, to keep going. What we as CIWM will call for is perhaps a rethink then of the resources and waste strategy, and we're talking in terms of maybe resource resilience strategy that then is more circular economy focused and brings in deeper EPR, more things around the design of products that enable our sector then to deal with them better. But yeah, on a basic level, I'd imagine that those policies should continue.
Okay, thanks. We're running out of time, so I'm going to allow myself one more question. I'm going to ask, I mean, it's simply because it's going back to the fragmentation of the industry, and it's going to be a difficult one to answer quickly, but we talked about different streams, the fragmentation of the industry. You've already indicated that one area where there's going to be a lot of potential ongoing investment is in the sorting technology and the infrastructure to get material to the sorting facilities. But I think as a supplier for a supply chain, it's very confusing. There are so many different contact points. Are there any recommendations where a new supplier, for example, in the UK market should begin? Should they be talking to the waste management companies first? Should they talk to council? Should they talk to are there other consultancy companies, the big planning companies, for example, or is it just a mixture of all of them and getting yourself as embedded as possible into the market?
I think the CIWM, ESA, RAP are really good initial points because there's also a lot of reports about it. While certainly all of the reputable consultancies will be able to help on an individual basis, there's also a lot of material available. And for example, Lee mentioned RWM. That's one of the big conferences where you can talk to loads of people and get a bit more advice on what's actually suitable for your product or for your service and what the best area is. So while we love to sell consultancy and love to help, but I think there's also a lot of other areas where you can have some easy wins and can make some really good inroads. Then, as we said, open table. There's lots of other discussion forums. So I think there's a lot of things that can be hoovered up before you need to get to your very specialist advice.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, I'd echo that. And yeah, in terms of household waste and commercial and industrial waste, it's those sort of organisations, and then you are getting into either the councils or the big waste management firms. Maybe on the construction and demolition side, it's perhaps more the construction companies that are worth talking to, because some of the bigger ones will be in effect be doing their own waste management. Now they probably won't see it as waste management in a way.
Yeah,
they'll just see it as part of the construction process. So it's probably on that side of things, it's probably worth thinking about talking to the actual construction companies themselves, rather than perhaps thinking more in waste management terms.
Okay, that's an interesting point on that side. Okay, I think we better leave it now because we are running out of time. Thank you very much, both Lee and Claudia, for a lot of insights. I think there was so much information there. Perhaps some of the audience need to process that anyway. So if anybody has questions that they think of after the webinar, do send them to us and we'll put them over to Claudia and Lee. Or the contact details of both our speakers will be sent to you with the slides after the event as well. So you please feel free to contact them direct as well. I'm going to just move on quickly to and actually what Lee was talking about and Claudia was talking about were events and roundtables, and we have our own events coming up actually in the sector. So I will just touch on that. A couple of dates for your diary. For the 14th to the 20th of October, we have a learning journey, and that's everything about the future of the circular economy, and this is particularly aimed at Austrian companies who want to take ideas back and enhance their operations back in Austria. That's already booking up, so you can register for that right now. It's limited in space, so please take the opportunity to look at that as quickly as possible while there are still places available. And we are planning also a Wirtschaftsmission, if you like, a trade mission, just to throw a bit of German in there, on recycling waste management to the Midlands in February, where we may well visit, or there'll be an option to visit one of the big packaging trade shows. And we will also be hoping to include actually roundtables and use that as an opportunity to actually meet some of the key stakeholders in the industry. So more information on that will come, but that is going to be from the 10th to 12th of February next year. So if you're interested in that event, do let me know. And as we're still formulating the detail of that, let me know if there is anything particular that you would want from that event as well. I'd like to hear from you about that too. So I'm going to thank you all now for attending. And I'm reminded there's something even more pressing to tell you about for our Austrian companies, and the export TAG is our next big event in Vienna, and that is taking place on the 18th of June in Vienna. You'll have an opportunity there. Please sign up to that, where you have the opportunity to meet our trade commissioners from different countries, including our very own Michael Muller, and to find out more and to put your questions about the UK economy and your particular sectors. So I do urge you to get involved in that as well. I'm now going to thank again Lee, and I'm going to thank Claudia for their very insightful presentations. I think that was really great. I will thank everybody for attending. It's great to have you here, and hopefully this is the beginning of a dialogue, and that we can continue to support you in this sector over the coming months and years. Thank you very much.